Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I am talking about rejecting the self. Now, this is something I think we chronically do because there is a acting from a center, a me. And as soon as the me arises, other than me also arises. They arise together. And so we're always rejecting or denying aspects of what is, which is self. Because in Advaita, in non-duality, there is only the self. There's the self and no other. There's no second. It's undivided, omnipresent. It's not other than what is. And we like to, prior to awakening, chronically reject and deny aspects of reality, which is self. It's only the self. And what I mean by this is I've had people talk about, well, in terms of, say, a serial killer. Well, a serial killer shouldn't be. How could the very question implies this kind of person shouldn't be. And that is, if you look at it, a flagrant rejection, a denial of self, because that too is self. Self too is in the serial killer. Self too is in Hitler. Self too is in any monster you can find in past history or currently. And what I mean, of course, is people that we would deem monsters or shouldn't exist. But that too is self. We need to observe ourselves. We need to be aware when we are denying, rejecting self. Now, this isn't as, impractical or airy-fairy or however you want to describe it. Some people like to dismiss this as an ideal that cannot be really practically done or otherwise want to dismiss the idea that it can be accepted. But even if you look at people that are not awake, there have been victims after court cases or whatever forgiving the person that murdered their relative. There are cases of people that have forgiven atrocities done to themselves. I'm sure there's a woman who's forgiven their rapist. I'm sure there's, these stories aren't often covered, but if you look around, you can discover them. And these people still believe in me and they still suffer. So they're not enlightened, and yet they're able to forgive such things. How can this be? Perhaps they've stumbled upon a truth for themselves that's deeper. And that, this too can be allowed to be. And if you take it from a different point of view, a mother is often unconditionally loving to their child. And so even if the child is a great sinner, so to speak, a murderer, a whatever, they still love their child and do not wish harm on them. And they plead for their children, perhaps some on death row in various states or in countries around the world, pleading for their not being executed. Why? Because they still care for them. So even among those not yet enlightened, there are cases where they are able to embrace even that which would be considered monstrous or darkness. Now, it is different when you talk about one who is awake, after realization, enlightenment, pick your term. After that, in deeply realizing and seeing that there's only the self, it just doesn't make sense to resist or deny or reject the self. I've spoken about similar topics in the past. And when I do so, inevitably, I have somebody will say, well, could you be so forgiving or not hate someone that murdered your own child? If someone murdered your own child, would you be able to forgive and not hate? And I would have to say, yes. They don't believe me when I say, yeah, I couldn't hate them, and they would be forgiven. Because the people that put forward such questions are so attached to me and mine, my child, that they cannot see a way to not be, so deeply in hate if something were to happen to their child. But that's all coming from an egoic me and self-preference. So it's one of those things where when you have that kind of rebuff, those watching the video, if you've got this kind of rebuff of, well, what if this horrible thing happened? Wouldn't that be the exception? Or how could you say this person should still be forgiven or deserving of love or not hated, or all these various things? People like just brushing away and dismissing this whole idea. But it is possible, and I think that as a practice, so to speak, it is worth observing and being aware of where your exceptions lie and really delving into them. Because if you can kind of go, yeah, I could see how I could, I don't have hate for this, that, or the other thing, and I could unconditionally love this, that, or the other thing, or I can unconditionally forgive or allow this, that, or the other thing, but I cannot allow this. That is something to look at. Because this, I cannot allow this, or this shouldn't be, that is a blatant rejection and denial of self. That too is self. That too is self. And so to say that shouldn't be is just to deny and reject self. And if you really want to understand non-duality and realize non-duality, it might be worth looking at where you are rejecting and denying. What is it that cannot be forgiven? What is it that cannot be loved? What is it that must be hated? Or, there's this righteousness, which is kind of an illusion, but you think it's perfectly okay to cut off and throw away certain aspects of society or whatever. Non-duality is not about, creating a utopia where you can finally feel at peace. Non-duality is realizing that which is at peace already. Being at peace now, regardless of the situation. And so, yes, the theoretical situation I'm sometimes thrown at. What if somebody was to find and murder my daughter? Would you be able to forgive? Would you be able to not hate? Yes, I'd be able to forgive. I wouldn't hate. It's because the understanding is different. There's only the self. I see the self. Why would I deny or reject self? There's just only self. That is the whole point of this video. And the whole point of non-duality and Advaita. There's only self. And so, to reject or deny the self is just another way to perpetuate a self-centered me and its preferences and its own attachments. And so if you delve into this and go, well, why am I really, hung up on rejecting or denying these certain aspects? It could be various reasons. You might have this idea of, well, this should be a perfect world, and a perfect world wouldn't have this. Well, that's a whole lot of illusion. It's an imagined utopia that does not exist. The whole point of this is in awakening enlightenment, you find peace with now, whatever it is, which includes whatever has happened in the past. So you're totally at peace with everything that's happened in the past. And yes, there have been horrible things that have happened. And there has been pain. And there's been suffering. But why is there potentially this idea that there should not be pain and suffering? Because, this arises due to ignorance. Due to ignorance, we hurt ourselves and we hurt each other. And so, really what somebody's saying is ignorance should not exist. Which is rather unrealistic. And so instead of denying the reality of not knowing, which is ignorance, we just don't know better. We don't know yet. We're not masters of life. And due to our upbringing and situation, we might have learned very different ways. But to condemn or reject or deny those ways as they should never existed in the first place is kind of a not facing the reality of things. It's wanting to dream of a utopia that just is not the case. So, yes, there is pain in the world, actually quite necessarily. There is suffering, totally self-created and self-inflicted. But these arise due to other potentialities, other advances. Because the organism that does not feel pain cannot have the sense of touch, and is likely to ignore wounds and find itself dying more quickly. The entity which does not have the capability to suffer basically has not a complex enough mind/brain to be able to create that in the first place. As part of the evolving, capacity of the brain and mind, humans are one of the animals able to experience suffering. It's one of the drawbacks to having such a complex brain, is being able to make ourselves miserable. But would you rather not have that? Really? Would you really not have that? Would you rather not have the potential? And if you really think, yeah, I'd rather not have the potential to suffer, then you're totally losing the upside to the potential. Because things arise together. There isn't the sense of touch without pain. Those arise together. And so if you like the sense of touch, what is better than a pat on the head or a caress up from a loved one? Would you really want to let that go? These things come together. They arise together. And so if you see them arising together, they're not such a big issue. Yeah, if pain arises, pain arises. But suffering need not arise. That's self-created and inflicted. So you can stop doing that to yourself. And then as you're looking out on the world, much of the issues of the sense of me and misery and suffering is because of our resisting and denying what is, which is self. When we try to say, this should not be, this should not exist, this should never have been. I mean, if things were built in such a way, and I'm talking about a creation idea, which I don't, isn't really what I believe in, but in terms of a model to talk about this, if the world was created in such a way that we were never capable of murdering each other, that's not a function that you could do, is to kill one of your own. Which, may on the surface sound like an awesome idea, but you don't realize that that potential has opened up doors on the positive side as well. The potential opens up doors both ways. And through ignorance, some go through one door. And through wisdom, others go through the other door. Some will misuse the potential and murder people. That's what happens. But at the same time, now if you look at this from more of a dramatic model as opposed to a creation model, without having the criminal, you could not have the cop. Just like children play cops and robbers. There's got to be a robber in order for there to be cops to play. And so without being able to do certain things, you're now already restricting free will, which makes it no longer really free will. Because if you could not choose to do something, if it was programmed in such a way you could not choose a certain action, well then you're really down to just DNA programming and what you're allowed to do. But as part of the ever-evolving organisms, these body minds that we have are capable of doing pretty much whatever we want and whatever we put our minds to, because of the complexity of what humans are. They could look at birds and go, oh, I wish we could fly, and then we create something so it allows us to fly. This is an incredible potential and possibility of having such freedom. But most people's idea of what a perfect world should be is removing all that freedom. It would necessitate having to remove all that freedom. You're not capable of doing these things in order to create their perfect world. In which case, would you really want to live in such a world? I don't know, I'm a little off track today, I guess. But, this is all kind of, I think, part and parcel. Because these are the different ways we want to deny what is. Oh, I don't think this aspect of reality should be. Well, that's denying the self. I don't think this kind of person should be. Well, that's denial of self. I don't think this kind of profession should be. Well, that's denial of self. Because you're just looking at what is. And what is always the self. If you're looking at what is and saying this shouldn't be, you are fundamentally rejecting the self. And it's worth observing our own rejections and delving into them and perhaps overcoming them, where we're no longer rejecting it. Perhaps seeing this too is part of reality. It is. And so just allow it to be. it is, so perhaps it too deserves love, regardless of the form it takes. Something to think about. But if you have any questions, comments, please post below. But until next time, thank you much.